Hey everybody, thanks a lot for coming out tonight. Welcome to Red Emma's. How many people, this is your first time at Red Emma's? Oh, that's good. Alright, well welcome, here we are. So most of you already know that Red Emma's is a fully worker-owned and run business. Radical bookstore, vegetarian cafe, coffee roastery, event center, all sorts of things. And we host the Baltimore Free School in the back room as well. So lots of cool stuff going on in here. Also, Red Emma's is organizing something that's coming up next weekend, which is called the Radical Book Fair Pavilion. It's at the Baltimore Book Fair, and a bunch of really cool names speaking there. There's going to be like tables, lots of presses and stuff, a lot of really cool stuff going on. But Cherry Moraga is going to be there, Tim Wise, Baltimore's D. Watkins will be speaking, Johanna Fernandez, Dave Zirin, who's down in DC, will be coming up to talk about sports and radical politics, which is his shtick. But so tonight, here we are, and oh, I also forgot to mention that there's another really cool event next Thursday with people from the Mexico Solidarity Network around the anniversary of the disappearance of the 43 students that really galvanized a lot of popular protests in Mexico. So, tonight, so we've got Vijay Prashad. I hope most of you are familiar with some of his work. He's like a jack of many trades, editor, publisher, writer, journalist, historian, activist, many things. And a really good speaker, and he's been putting out some really critical books recently in the last few years, specifically talking about making meaning of the Arab Spring, both domestically and internationally. And so one of his books, Arab Spring, Libyan Winter, did a really good job of both recognizing the hope and the possibility that was emerging in that time period, but also looking at the dark side of it and looking at the role of the international community in shaping some of the events there. And then he also put out Dispatches from the Arab Spring, which is a book that unfortunately I don't think we have right now. I think it's because we're sold out of it, but oh, we do have a few, okay. Oh, maybe not. Well, either way, it's a good book, bringing together voices from the actual countries that they're writing about, intellectuals and activists, which I think was the first kind of book of its kind in English, really trying to actually take people from those places and talk about them. Also, People's History of the Third World, The Darker Nations, an amazing book, I think shining light on a period of history that a lot of us don't even know happened, which just was published last week in Korean for the first time, which is really cool. So this man's stuff is getting around the world. He's here tonight. He's got a new book called Letters to Palestine, which is a collection of American and Palestinian American writers writing on the issue of Palestine. And here is the man in question, Vijay Prashad.
The last time I came to Red Emma's, I spoke across the road at the Mica. Is that right?
Yes.
Mica. Because this place hadn't been finished yet. So this is my first visit to the Red Emma's bookstore, and it's incredible. So Kate, John, you guys have done a terrific job, your entire collective. These institutions are hard to find increasingly. And to support them, I think, is to be alive. So I hope you eat a lot, drink a lot, and before you leave, buy lots of books. That's really the essence of being alive. Is to buy a book from a place that you're happy with and that you love. And what's not to love about some place that is so bright and beautiful? Soon, you will also come to a book launch by a friend of mine who's holding her delightful son Ahi back there, and I want to show you her book cover, which I think is beautiful. It's called We Too Sing America, or America, because the whole point is to move from America to America. Thank God for Donald Trump. If I had my way, I'd spend the entire half an hour, 40 minutes talking about Donald Trump. Most entertaining human being, most strange country with its strange politics. I watched the last presidential debate. It was extraordinary. There were, I don't know how many of them on stage. It was extraordinary. Some of them actually seemed unreal to me. as if they were not real, like literally not real. Among whom Marco Rubio was, I thought, number one, and Ted Cruz, who stared right into the camera, and I felt terrified. There was something, it was as if he was drawing me out, my soul, through the television, and eating it, accumulating souls. So, when we talk about other places in the world, like let's say the Arab world or South Asia or Latin America, let's take a moment of silence about the literally crap politics in the United States of America. It's so easy to criticize what's happening around the world, but my God, anything, anywhere in the world seems better than this. Anything. I mean, the war in Syria is abysmal. The catastrophe is unimaginable. The politics is befuddling. But the gap between that befuddling politics and this is only in terms of the scale of the destruction. Although, walking through some American streets, it looks like there's been carpet bombing. So I'm not sure that even that is altogether so different. The destruction of carpet bombing of cities by capital is no less than the barrel bombing of a city by a government. They seem to have the same kind of effect. When I came here to Red Emma's, I think 2.5, 3 years ago, I had come because Kate had basically forced me to write Arab Spring, Libyan Winter. Libya, which is one of my favorite countries in the world. I first went there when I was about 7 years old. Had a magical experience driving from Alexandria to Benghazi and then down to Tripoli. And I was 7 years old, and this was a time when on the road from Tobruk, no, before Tobruk even, actually the border, the Egyptian border, you see old German weaponry on the side of the road. Because as yet, in the late 60s, early 70s, the weaponry was still there. Because Libya's two main exports were grass, literally, not marijuana, but grass for paper making, and secondly, scrap metal from World War II, before, of course, oil became the major export. But it was a magical trip, and during the uprising in 2011, I had reported the conflict. I, of course, had the chance to report from Libya since then, and watched the absolute unraveling and destruction of that country. And I'm going to come back to that in a minute, about what that has meant, what that conflict or that war has meant. But first, the great turmoil in Greater Arabia. Look, it's hard to know where to begin. There's a tendency in our, at least media maybe, and maybe even in our hope or in our sense of wanting something good to happen in the world, to begin the story when it looks good, which is to say when hundreds of thousands of people first marched into Tahrir Square in 2011 January, and many numbers of people, not the same scale, marched in Tunisia in December 2010. There's a tendency to want to begin the story there, because that's a moment of hope. And if you begin the story there, then you want that hope to realize itself, to win, because that's the beginning, and the end can only be good. But if you begin elsewhere, other stories have to come into the picture. And so I want to begin by suggesting to you that what has been happening in West Asia, largely, is a consequence, in a way, partly, of an unfinished unraveling from the Iranian Revolution of 1978-79. That the Iranian Revolution of 78-79 didn't ever settle into a modus vivendi in the region. There have constantly been attempts to revise the power equation in the region since 1977, 78, 79. And that has had effects right through to the present. That doesn't mean that nothing started in 2010, 2011. It merely means that there are other social processes that you have to put into the story additionally. You have to have all these together. In 1978-79, when the Iranian Revolution took place and when the Islamic Republic seized power of that revolution, very quickly there was an attempt by particularly the Gulf monarchies to sabotage or to strangle this new event. And one of the reasons that the Gulf monarchies took umbrage at the emergence of the Islamic Republic wasn't merely because it was so-called a Shia republic and that the Gulf monarchies are Sunni. It wasn't merely sectarian, it was also political. Because after all, the Gulf monarchies had as their biggest enemy prior to the Iranian Revolution Arab nationalists. And Arab nationalists, such as say Nasserism, but also the regime of Qasim in Iraq, etc., Arab nationalists were generally secular. And it was easy to dismiss the secular Arab nationalists as anti-Islamic. It was easy to dismiss them as people without religion. And therefore, the custodian of the two mosques could say, we are the upholders of the true culture of the region, whereas these people are westernized upstarts. Well, with the Iranian Revolution, there was a problem. Because the Islamic Republic was not only a republic, in other words, anti-monarchical, but also it was not secular. It posed a challenge to the Gulf monarchies on the platform that they had rested securely, which was that they were the only authentic rulers, or they were the only ones able to govern on an Islamic platform, and that monarchies somehow were the natural outcome of the foundation of Islam, that Islam produces monarchies, not democracies. Now, of course, this is an absurd idea that you needed the Iranian Revolution to display this, because after all, the largest numbers of Muslims in the world don't live in West Asia. They live in Indonesia, they live in India, they live in Pakistan, they live in Bangladesh. After all, Pakistan had a republic, an Islamic republic, long before the Iranian Revolution. In fact, the 1952 constitution, I think, in Pakistan, when it was an Islamic republic. After all, in Indonesia, in the coup of '65, when Suharto comes to power, they bring Islam as part of their framework. So it's not uncommon to have Islamic foundations for a Republican government. But it was not, let's say, so close to the Saudis or the other Gulf monarchies. And that played a very important role in the antipathy to the Iranians, because you might remember that right after the Iranian Revolution, there was an attempt inside the main mosque in Mecca, where some crazy Salafi priest, a crazy Salafi sheikh decided to run into the mosque with his friends, and they took it over. And they had to be violently removed from there. It was a very great threat to the custodian of the two mosques and their regime. At the same time, in Pakistan, there was an uprising also on the Islamic Foundation, which included the takeover of the US Embassy in Islamabad, which is not as well known, but parallel to the Iranian takeover in Tehran, the Islamabad Embassy was taken over by a group with an Islamic foundation. So this was a fear, a genuine fear. And of course, it is at this point that the Saudis and others invite Saddam Hussein for a visit, and Saddam Hussein is told, we'll pay you $1 billion, go and attack Iran. And that's what happens in 1980, when the Iraqis or Saddam's army marches against Iran. Now, I said that you must begin here because there's an unfinished project underway since 1979. Well, from 1979 till 2001, 2003, there was a serious international effort to isolate Iran, pushed by this invasion by the Iraqis into Iran. That war lasted, is a brutal war from 1980 to 1988, included the use of horrific chemical weapons, not only against the Iranians, but against Iraqi dissidents. For instance, the Kurds in northern Iraq in the city of Halabja were attacked with chemical weapons, weapons which we know, which are on the record, having been provided by such great democratic and enlightened governments as the government of the Federal Republic of Germany, the United States, including that very fine public servant of the US government, Donald Rumsfeld, who goes with his demarche from the White House to go and meet Saddam Hussein. Terrific photographs, but there are enough records to show how so-called dual-use chemical mechanisms were transferred to the Iraqis, which they then convert into a chemical weapons program to use not against Israel, not against the West, but against Iran. Until 2001-2003, Iran was relatively hemmed in by this onslaught. The Bush administration, known for its eagerness to go to war, but perhaps not for its long-term strategic thinking, decided within 2 years to take out two important powers in the region. One, they decided to go after the Taliban regime in Afghanistan. Now, interestingly, one of the great enemies of the Taliban in the region was the Iranian government. And when the US government went to war against the Taliban, the Iranians supported them. And in fact, the man now reviled in Syria and in Iraq, General Qasem Soleimani, was on the ground in Herat as part of the Iranian Special Forces team helping the Americans, weirdly, take out the Taliban, because they saw the Taliban as an important and dangerous enemy of theirs. Fine. 2 years later, not sufficient to take out Iran's enemy on its eastern flank, the United States government, led by George Bush and his very bright people in the State Department and Pentagon, decided it might be a great idea to take out Saddam Hussein, which is what they then did in that illegal invasion in 2003. And so now, within the space of 2 years, the United States government took out Iran's two great bookend regimes, the two enemies of Iran that had hemmed Iran in the region. The Taliban on one side and the Ba'athist regime of Saddam Hussein on the other. And, well, the Iranians did what any normal civilization would do, which is that once the doors and windows were open, well, they began to not only breathe the air from outside, but they began to walk out into Afghanistan and Iran and Iraq and begin to spread their wings. This is an old power, thousands of years old, that is Iran, which has had a regional influence for a very long time. So that tendency towards regional influence was asserted in 2003 onward. Now, I'm not going to go into details, I don't have time, but the nature of the new American-backed government in Iraq was deeply sectarian. And people who had, the exile's revenge view of history, such as the Islamic Dawa Party, returned to Iraq to take power in Baghdad, again on the wings of an American plane. But of course, the Dawa Party was largely in exile in Iran. So on the one side, they were backed by Iran, but secondly, they had a less capacious understanding, a less full understanding of their own country. And they wanted to rule in a narrow way. I don't have time to go into that. Suffice it to say that having opened the door to Iranian power in the region, there were now 3 attempts at least to hem Iran in. Attempt number 1 was a bill passed by the US Congress called the Syria Accountability Act, because it was clear that Syria was an ally of this expanded Iran, particularly because Syria was the conduit for arms entering the hands of the Lebanese militia Hezbollah. That arms would fly into Damascus airport, cross the border into the hands of Hezbollah, and was arming Hezbollah beyond what they had in 2000 when they expelled Israel from southern Lebanon. So the Syria Accountability Act wasn't really about Syria, I'll come back to that in a minute. It was mostly about Iran's influence in Hezbollah and the conduit for arms. Second attempt to crush Iranian influence was the Israel war against Lebanon in 2006, which had been basically, as most people will, even people who like the war will recognize, was a war to destroy Hezbollah. But of course, having now been heavily rearmed by the Iranians and received a different level of training, and of course being with the feeling that Hezbollah had thrown the Israelis out of Lebanon in 2000, Hezbollah was difficult, almost impossible to beat. They destroyed large parts of Beirut, destroyed large parts of the south, but Hezbollah still struck its blows against the Israelis. So that was the second attempt to hem in Iran. It didn't work, neither did the first. The third attempt, of course, was the nuclear sanctions regime. Now, again, I don't have time to go into the details on this, but it's amazing that suddenly in the 2000s, Iran's nuclear program became an issue. It had not been an issue since the 1950s, when the Americans delivered nuclear material to Iran as part of the Atoms for Peace program. This was not even a huge issue in 1979, because the war against Iran by Iraq had basically shut down the nuclear program inside Iran because they diverted all their funds to the military. And they had said at the time they will not use chemical weapons. That's very interesting. The first fatwa against chemical weapons in Iran comes from Ayatollah Khomeini, who said that despite the fact they are using it against us, we will not use it. It's an abomination against God, etc., whatever. But they didn't use chemical weapons. That's on record. That's interesting, that they didn't attack with weapons of mass destruction. Nonetheless, in the 2000s, suddenly the nuclear issue becomes a matter and the sanctions regime ratchets up. Because this becomes the most effective way to try to constrain Iranian power in the region once more. And it provides Saudi Arabia, this is very important for the war in Yemen now, it provides Saudi Arabia for an increasingly aggressive language from the 2000s onward about the danger of Iran and its proxies in the region. This was a gift given by essentially the Israelis and the Americans to the Saudis. The language they had used vis-a-vis Hezbollah becomes now the language the Saudis will use against anybody that they find threatening, is a proxy of Iran. For instance, the Zaidi movement in Yemen, which has almost zero connection to Iran, is suddenly an Iranian proxy. And nobody really counters the fact whether that's true or not. And they can pummel the hell out of Yemen and nobody complains. So, Iran breeds after 2003 and all these new straitjackets are placed upon it. Now, that's one part of the story. The second part of the story is by the 1990s, most of these Arab national democratic, so-called democratic regimes had begun to falter under the full weight of neoliberal policy, global policy. In Egypt, in Syria, in Libya, they all had to make accommodations to IMF pressure. If they wanted to sell their commodities like Libya, if they wanted to re-enter the world market, which they call the world community, it's really the world market, they have to apologize for past wrongs, etc. So Libya had to essentially get on its knees, beg the West to forgive it, put a down payment for the Lockerbie, bombing, and say we apologize for that. And then the Europeans, including Sarkozy, Blair, all these fine embodiments of humanity, return to Libya to sleep in Gaddafi's tent. They shake hands for oil deals, and people like Tony Blair says the greatest guy ever is Muammar Gaddafi. Okay, all these countries have to make accommodations. Syria made the most obscene accommodations in a way, because they completely opened the economy. And the first people that came in weren't the Westerners, but Turkish capital. Particularly the newly emboldened Anatolian businesses, whose own political party, the Justice and Development Party, the AKP, was coming to power, and there was a great confidence among this new set of Anatolian business people who were not tied to the old Republican state, the Kemalist state, whose elite was based in Istanbul. These were people based in Anatolia. They had manufacturing of different scales. They wanted to sell peanut butter, Nutella. You go to a grocery store anywhere in the Arab world, all this stuff is Turkish. Biscuits, it's like in India. India, a country of 1.3 billion, biscuits are imported from China. Surely out of the 1.3 billion, somebody can make biscuits. You don't have to import biscuits from China. It's obscenity. But the Syrians basically, invalidated their development agenda and welcomed in capital and real estate capital from Turkey. Huge real estate capital comes in. What these countries did in opening up to the global market, the Western market, was they made the worst end of the deal for the population. If you remember, the old so-called national democratic states, Nasserist states, etc., had made a deal with the population, which is, look, we will run the politics, we'll take care of the bad guys, we'll throw them in prison, etc. We'll hang them upside down and beat them with leather sticks or whatever. But we'll make sure the bread is subsidized, we'll make sure you get housing, we'll make sure you get petroleum, all your livelihood will be taken care of. You give us political power, we give you the means to live. Well, with this change in the 1990s, what they essentially said to their population was, we will retain the right to political monopoly, and we're not even going to feed you anymore. And we're not even going to have jobs for you. We're not even going to get you housing. There's going to be Turkish real estate money coming in, and they're going to leverage the housing market beyond your capacity, and you're going to have to find a way to be entrepreneurs in this global market, etc. And of course, you might know the IMF, World Bank gave them all high marks right through till 2011. Bashar al-Assad was getting high marks. Gaddafi, in Tunisia, Ben Ali, the IMF report that came out in December 2010 said that this is the most capable administration. In 2020 December, the IMF staff report. So just bear in mind, there are lots of criminals involved here. It's easy to say this is one criminal. If you do that, you miss the story. You just say, get rid of this one guy and it'll all change. I'm warning you against that kind of thinking, because then you'll be disappointed when that guy goes. Because all the old social processes will reassert themselves. So it's not as simple as that. It's more complicated. So, the second storyline begins with this shift in the so-called national democratic states of the 1990s. When I said the Syria Accountability Act was not really about Syria, that's because Syria, Libya, and Egypt had already fully cooperated with the global war on terror. I mean, their prisons were part of the archipelago that George Bush and his cronies had produced, where their so-called extraordinary rendition prisoners were sent again to be hung upside down, beaten with leather straps, whatever. And then now, of course, after the global war on terror, you'd have a CIA agent in the room taking notes with a interpreter, sometimes Arab-American interpreter, whispering in their ear, telling them what the person being beaten is being said. For instance, Curveball, who said that Saddam is, has a relationship with Al-Qaeda, being beaten in an Egyptian prison cell, etc. So these states were actually not antithetical to the West during the high point of the global war on terror. That's the second dynamic. The third, bear in mind, and I'll be very quick on this, is the question of climate change. It plays a huge role in many of these conflicts. I don't know how many of you read Mahmoud Mamdani's book on Darfur, but I strongly recommend it. The Sahel has desiccated. The Sahara is increasing. The land pressure and resource pressure in Sudan, in Upper Egypt, in Libya, which I know better than these other two, the pressure on land and water has been incredible in this region. In Syria, in 2010, in northwest Syria, where Raqqa is today, where Raqqa has been then as well, in that area there was a drought, which had a serious problem and displaced the peasantry from that area into the cities along the spinal cord of Syria, which runs essentially from Aleppo down to Daraa, but mainly into Aleppo, into those cities. It brought the peasantry who was starving. Put that in line with a change in Russian wheat harvest. There was a drought in Russia, wheat prices go up. This was the catalyst. This was really the catalyst of the Arab Spring. It's easy to talk about Bouazizi committing suicide, but let me tell you something. If you go anywhere in the global south, these kind of events are a dime a dozen. There is somebody humiliated who goes out there and kills himself in front of a municipal building. In Bangkok, there have been a number of people burning immolating themselves because of this coup government. This doesn't necessarily engender massive demonstrations, that was a conjunctural event that people remember, but underneath that was the bread price question. And Mubarak knew that in Egypt in particular, he made a great error. In 2010, they cut the subsidy. And during the protest, they tried to reinstate it, but it was too late, and they were gone. Now, there's a big difference between having an uprising and being able to win. You can take a square, but to overthrow a state is very hard. And we should know that sitting here more than anything. You can occupy somewhere, but that doesn't mean you're going to overthrow them. You can run a riot on the streets on one day and control the street, but they're going to come back at you really hard. So that is something that I think is important. And I'll give you a very quick and silly demonstration of what I mean. In my travels in that region, I'm going to describe 3 different military camps. And this is a way to explain how I understand state power. In Libya, after the 1987 war against Chad, the military was totally destroyed. It was disheartened. There was no military focus. So in Benghazi, before 2011, if you needed to interview somebody in the military, you could just walk right into the military camp. The gate was open, there were boats going in and out. It was chaos. There was no discipline. There was nothing like a real military focus. So when the uprising begins in 2011, the military just essentially disappears. You know, where is the Libyan military today? You know, in Iraq, people still think, where is the military? Well, they joined this Ba'athist group, they joined that group, they joined, you know, maybe they were the backbone of ISIS in the early years, whatever. In Libya, where is the military? It has just vanished. Because there was no military in my mind after 87. Gaddafi was holding power on a very flimsy thread. And I think they knew that very well. Which is why they so quickly made an accommodation with the West. And including an accommodation to get rid of nuclear weapons. That was part of the deal. Because they didn't want any kind of so-called regime change. That didn't stop Gaddafi from acting like a lunatic, by the way. He went to the Arab League meeting, where he sat down and publicly said to the king of Saudi Arabia, you are a creation of the British, and then he turned to the Qatari Emir and said, and you are a dog of the Americans. They're going to come get you. You talk about them like that, you're dead. Okay, you might give up nuclear weapons to appease the Americans, but forget it, the Gulf Arabs hated it. And anyway, whatever, he was also, we can talk about him later. Second military camp, you go into Egypt. This is interesting. In Egypt, if you go to a military camp, the people guarding the gate, where there is some discipline, are much darker skinned than the elite Egyptians. They come from Upper Egypt, from rural areas, where political organization is none. In Upper Egypt, the main political party at that time was essentially the party of Mubarak, you know, his shell political party. So it was a fraudulent, it was the old elites would go and walk around and they would all be voted in. Nobody else was allowed. Those areas are held with a great deal of force and lack of alternative. You know, you ask people who are involved in the Tahrir movement, what connection did you have with rural Egypt? Virtually nil. Nil connection, particularly with Upper Egypt. So the military is of a totally different cultural world than the world of Egyptian politics. And I can come back to that in a minute. It would be hard to supplant or to take charge of the military. In Syria, forget it. The military there was of a different league. They had been trained by the Eastern Europeans. Their style of operating is different. You can't just walk into a camp. They look well fed, they are tough. They were a little scary, intimidating. More than anything else, they had learned to fight in that old strategy. You line up the howitzers, you bomb the hell out of your enemy. When there's no more yelling, you go and send a young person to see anybody alive. If there's rat-a-tat-tat, you bomb more. That's the old Eastern European style of military fighting. That's what they were trained in. This is not a military that was going to, you know, dissolve overnight like in Libya. So if you understand state power, just because these are Arab countries doesn't mean they're all identical. So it was silly for people to assume that because in Libya it was going to fall apart overnight, it would fall apart like that in Syria. These are different countries with different histories and different capacities of the military. If you want to take power, just standing in a square is not enough. You have to build political organization. You have to be able to turn the sources of political authority in the state, especially the military. If you don't get the military on your side, you will not be able to make a revolution. Lesson number 1 from the Soviet Revolution, which we will look at in 2017. It will have been 100 years. If they didn't get the military on their side, they would have been crushed. Because after all, they were also small numbers of workers entering into squares and demanding the overthrow of the regime. But they got the military to their side because they had spent years organizing inside the front, in that brutal front of World War I. Militaries don't turn automatically. They have to be organized and won over. That's something to consider. This uprising takes place the inevitable starts to happen, which is, remember I said there's an unfinished business with the Iranian Revolution. And very quickly, very, very fast, the Gulf Arabs enter the game. Initially, there was a contest between the Qataris and the Saudis. And this contest is interesting because it is rigged to some extent just in terms of geopolitics, but also in terms of who they backed. The Qataris, linked with the Turks, for instance, backed all the Muslim Brotherhood groups in North Africa. So this, organization called Al-Nahda, largely an exiled group, returns to Tunis and within days buys a very fancy building in downtown Tunis. Where does an exiled movement get the money? It's like walking into Baltimore and buying a bank building in downtown Baltimore. How did you do that? How do you just come and buy? Well, the Qataris and Turks came in and underwrote their emergence. They tried to do the same thing in Libya, so that one government, the government in Tripoli, is largely still backed by the Qataris and the Turks. Whereas, or less the Turks, mostly the Qataris, whereas the second government in Libya is backed by the Saudis and the UAE. So there was a so-called New Arab Cold War that developed. In the middle of this, the Saudis began to fund all their cutouts, their various proxies, with enormous amount of money, very, very early on. In Syria, the emergence of Jais al-Islam was extraordinary. How did this group, led by a guy by the name of Zaran Aloush, whose father is a cleric in Saudi Arabia, how did he suddenly create an army? Like, where does his army come? Where did the money come from? Well, the money was coming from Saudi Arabia. And interestingly, the language that the Saudis pushed is the language of sectarianism. That was their principal language that they had been pushing since, actually not even the Iranian Revolution, but since 1964, when they created the World Muslim League, which pushed a kind of sectarian language in South Asia, in Chechnya, in Dagestan, in various parts of the Arab world, etc. And they come in with an enormous amount of money and start to essentially suffocate the civic rebellion. That starts very, very early. Linked to their suffocation, which had its greatest, most catastrophic impact in Syria, was the detritus of the Iraq War. Because, again, Bush and company, they overthrew the government there, and then they did this incredible thing. They banned all Iraqi soldiers from rejoining the Iraqi army. And they disbanded the Ba'ath Party. Now, we can go into the merits of that in terms of whether it's a good idea to disband the Ba'ath Party. Leave that aside. Just practically, suddenly you had tens of thousands of people who were unemployed and couldn't get a job. And these were some of the people, at least the very most skilled people in Anbar and other regions in the Noah, that joined up with various groups, not directly to Al-Qaeda in Iraq, Al-Qaeda in Mesopotamia initially, but they join up with various groups that have linkages with them. So some of them are like Fedayeen Saddam, the Saddam army, or later one of Saddam's closest friends, actually not just associate but friends, Izzat al-Duri, will create the Naqshband army. It's bizarre because in South Asia, Naqshbandis are known as these Sufis who like to sing and, they are the coolest Sufis you can imagine. But in Iraq, these Naqshbandis are totally different. They're not the same kind of Naqshbandis. These guys are severe and I guess they follow Izzat al-Duri, who had red hair. Looks a little bit like Redbeard, the pirate. He's an extraordinary looking man. May still be alive, close to 95. They keep saying he's dead, but it's hard to say. Anyway, they provided, I was astounded in reporting in northern Iraq. You would meet these trucks ready to cross into the border. This is before ISIS took Mosul, ready to cross the border into Syria. And there'll be, of course, you have to have white Toyota trucks, and there'll be all these Jesus-looking jihadi fellows there, but there would also be these highly disciplined 40-year-olds, slight pot belly, Saddam mustache, but disciplined people, holding things together. And these are the core commanders from the old Iraqi army that provided the early ISIS with battlefield training. I mean, ISIS is not from, I've seen these fellows in the mountains in Lebanon and such. These jihadis like to run at the enemy with their machine guns firing, and then they get shot. I mean, these are not the best tactical fighters. But they had some of the best trainers, hardened battle trainers, because after all, these 40, 45-year-old battlefield commanders had fought against Iran, many of them as young men, and understood tactical maneuvers, and understood how to fight, how to retreat, and they produced, in a sense, for this new insurgency, a sophistication. And when ISIS sends its first group into Syria, they come under the name of Jabhat al-Nusra, the support front. And they will enter the fight having been trained by some of these extraordinary fighters. Now, I'm not going to go into the absolute abomination of Syria. You can ask me questions, whatever. I want to come to something else very quickly. But anyway, I just want to make one point about this. The absolute abomination that became in Syria. How interesting it is that some of the most brutal chaps that appear in these videos are neither Iraqi nor Syrian but British. Why don't the British have to answer for what they've produced, this brutality? Those fellows doing the beheadings, they all seem to come from London. But somehow the British are not held responsible for the making of brutality. And secondly, of course, the more obvious point is that when you bomb from the sky and obliterate entire families, as the Israelis know very well, or the Saudis in Yemen, or the Americans in Iraq, somehow that's not as barbaric as somebody, beheading somebody. These are all barbaric forms of violence. None of them are better than any other. I don't mean to say one is better or one is thing. They're all barbaric. They're all equivalent in my book. But nonetheless, these chaps come from the fellows who fought from Iraq were mostly adept at battlefield attacks, and that is why al-Nusra in Aleppo, in Homs, etc. had great successes against the Syrian army, and even against Hezbollah. And I interviewed somebody from Hezbollah, and he told me that he said that the only people we are scared of fighting in Syria are Jabhat al-Nusra. And I asked him why. He said because they, A, know how to fight, and secondly, they are willing to fight in close quarters. So unlike, say, the Syrian army that likes to sit behind the lines and bomb and then walk in, both Hezbollah and Jabhat al-Nusra will go right at each other from 10 feet away. Of course, the same thing with the PKK fighters and the YPG. They are also very good at close combat fighting. None of them have close air support on their side, which is important. But that's also another question I'm not going to get to. Now, having said initially that it is an unsettled relationship with the Iranian Revolution of 1978-79, that is what's partly emerging once again in this conflict. It's not merely a conflict about the Assad regime in Syria. It's not merely about the massive and very, very resilient popular energy for a new kind of politics, which you saw once again in Baghdad last month, once again in Beirut. Massive demonstrations, the Youth Think protest in Beirut. Again, the refoundation of groups like Bread and Freedom in Egypt, a new socialist movement, growing in strength even in the countryside. All these things are true. These dynamics are true. Nonetheless, the unfinished business of the Iranian Revolution and its relationship to the region and the world is, I think, very much there for our consideration. You cannot make a revolution, I would argue, in that region without solving this problem. Particularly the problem of the major counter-revolutionary bloc, which is, of course, led by Saudi Arabia, and increasingly developing Saudi-Israeli axis, with the Americans as the godfathers of that arrangement. So where does this leave us? Well, I would say first that one of the most positive things that has happened in the last 10 years since the 2000s attempt to strangle Iran has been the nuclear deal. I think this is a very important opening. I think the tantrum that the Saudis are displaying in Yemen will create some major problems for the Saudi government. There's going to be very serious repercussions for a war which they just cannot seem to win. A lesson they should have taken from the Israelis. Because however many times Israelis keep trying to bomb Gaza, 2014, 2012, 2009, I mean, it's sequential. There's like a punctuality to their bombing rates. However many times they've tried to bomb Gaza, they have not succeeded in pacifying and destroying the Palestinian people. In the same way, however many times the Saudis have been bombing the crap out of Yemen, they just cannot seem to stop what's happening in Yemen. And even more than that, just as in the Israeli case, when the Israelis entered Gaza, they took a lot of casualties on the ground. When the two times the Saudis have tried to enter Yemen, they've taken casualties. So the question of blowback for Saudi Arabia from this Yemen war, the emerging consensus around the nuclear deal, which the Europeans have oil-related interests in here, there are too many complicated things, not for now, but that deal, the importance of the impossibility of Saudi hegemony both in Yemen and in Syria is, I think, a little turning point. Now, last time I was talking to various people who play some role in the region, I learned something interesting, which is that exhaustion is not easy to arrive in the middle of a struggle. In Algeria, if you ask progressive left-wing Algerians, organizers, trade unionists, why didn't you have an uprising against the government? After all, obscenely, the ruling party put forward, a 300-year-old man to run again, and he won. And I mean, look, it's a dignity question. He needs to retire, and he needs to live a few years of his life by the Mediterranean, smoke, nargila, enjoy the scenery. He doesn't need the stress. Let him relax. Find somebody else. Algerians are brilliant people. You meet Algerian diplomats, they're intelligent. Surely there are other people who can run the country. You don't have to keep putting this guy. Why wasn't there uprising? And he said, we were exhausted by the war of the 1990s. That even the left is terrified of opening the door again. That exhaustion is coming to very large parts of West Asia. As Americans, I think the most important thing to do is to try to settle some of this tension that has existed since 1978-79. If openings are to come in the Arab world, that geopolitical uncertainty about the role of Iran has to be settled. There is no way that any kind of revolutionary change can be sustained in the region with Saudi Arabia believing that it is the dominant player. Because it will not allow any kind of democratic change anywhere. It might be possible for Saudi Arabia to back the overthrow of Bashar al-Assad, but what will come after will be something that suits the Saudis, not something that suits us. We have a different opinion of the world. We who are socialists, we who are of the left, have a different opinion of the world. I don't like any of these governments. I want a different kind of government, but I'm not naive. I understand that when you go from one military camp to the next, some of them look like they've already disappeared, some look like they're not disappearing soon. If you were to even ask me, have you tried to enter a US camp? In Qatar, I rented a taxi. I asked the taxi driver to take me up to the American base. As we were driving up to the base, within about 10 miles or so, suddenly a jeep arrives. Because they got to have some drones or something, looking at this cab driving alone toward the base, unauthorized driving on a public Qatari road. But what is a public Qatari road? It's all owned by the Emir. And the jeep said, you have no business, go back. So, in Libya, I can walk into a military base. In Egypt, there are underfed fellows from Upper Egypt who will smile at you, but they are not going to listen to you. In Syria, there's no chance of entering the base. The American base, you can't even approach it. They'll kill you before you even get there. So let's understand the real source of power. And when we want to help and support the overthrow of regimes, the bit you can do is not scream and cry about the details of politics elsewhere. We need to change the dispensation here and American allies and its relationship to those allies. The two biggest problems the world faces are the American blank check to Israel and the American blank check to Saudi Arabia. And until those blank checks have a date put to them and that account is closed, I'll submit to you, millions of people can go on the street from Kabul all the way to Marrakesh and they will be destroyed. And then you can hold demonstrations calling to account the violence in Morocco, the violence in Afghanistan, and the US State Department will send a statement supporting your actions. But you should full well know that while they support your actions for standing on the street, they are supporting the governments over there for massacring people. So this is our responsibility, not our fight to fight about the details of other people's lives. Thanks a lot.